All right, so this is going to be, all right, let me get the right thing on. Here we go. So we are going to enter into session 3 of the topics that we're looking at. We looked, first of all, at a general idea of where we are going with education in general, but also some specific ideas with online specifically. And then we talked about something called backward design. And before we go further, I had a question. Is it backward design or backwards design? Is there an S at the end of the backward? That's a really important question.
I think it's just backward.
Okay.
No S.
Well, you're from Texas, so you'll...
I think your thinking is backwards, Ken.
Yeah. Well, it's those little things. Like, is it there's an S? Is there not an S? Like, so, okay. And when we, and I'm going to see if I got this right here. So, as we're thinking about this, is this the right way to think about it? Where we have like our outcomes. This is what we're starting with, where we want the students to be. Then we figure out if there, how we would assess that, whether, how we're going to figure out whether that outcome actually happened or not. And then based on the kind of assessment that we are going to be engaging in, then we go ahead and plan the activities. Is that generally the way that we were thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Yeah,
so,
I would say the bottom one of activities, I would say it would be content and activities. So what do students need to know and do? So it goes together, and that is, the bulk of the daily part of your teaching.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So my role, what they're going to do. Yeah. So that's sort of where this session is going to be headed, where we're actually thinking of what do you do when the class is happening? Like, okay, Monday morning, I have a class. Well, do I talk to them? Do I have them do a worksheet, show them a video? Like, what do we do with this? So as we think about this, we're going to just jump in, and we have a few questions to walk through. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in with this first question. And I guess it's maybe more of a summary than a specific question. But we had talked previously about student engagement and how that is probably the most important thing that we do. Because if a student is not engaged, we, what's the point, right? And then some of this has to do with attention span, things like that. And then less is more. And I think both Aaron and Sam used that phrase, less is more. Sam, why is this an important kind of motto to keep in front of us as we design things?
Well, a large part of it is because, especially if we're talking about strictly online learning environments, the students, it's predominantly an asynchronous. It's not that it goes against synchronous kinds of engagements with students, but it's more predicated towards or leans towards asynchronous activity and engagement. And so even though we have content, we have to think through the content and the sizable amount of that, and then disseminating information and the content, delivering systems, those kinds of things to the student. It could be quite overwhelming simply because they just do not have the time to engage. So less is more in the sense of that you create, like Aaron made this comment earlier, that it's about quality, not quantity. And so that's really a key for students in using the less is more principle that we just think, well, we're the experts. We have all the information. We want to deliver all this information and this content to the students. And it, quite frankly, just becomes too overwhelming, especially in an online environment. So less is more is kind of the strategy, the way to think about that. So it's really about the quality more than the quantity.
Yeah. And when we go back to thinking about our outcomes, we're not just wanting to accomplish cognitive outcomes, but we're also want to accomplish effective ones. So we want students to value the subject. And if we just overwhelm them with content, they're not going to have the time to process, to receive what we're talking about, and to get to where they love the subject.
Yeah, I would say like when you dump truck someone where you just pile on all of this reading and all of these little assignments, they essentially end up teaching themselves because they might not have as much engagement with the instructor as they're working through all of this. And then it begins to feel like busy work. And when you get to the point where a student feels like what you're assigning is just simply busy work or something that goes through the motions, you absolutely lose all engagement for the content, for the course, for the interaction. There's no richness to that feel of it's one more paper, one more assignment, but what am I getting out of it? If I'm not getting to talk with my peers, if I'm not getting to interact with this massive amount of content, what am I getting out of it? And if I can't find what I'm getting out of it, it's worthless to me. So it is the idea that if we just throw them a giant list of expectations to read and do on their own, even if we do have the occasional video or we interact in a forum, we're still setting them up for disengagement through becoming self-teachers. And that's not what we want for our students.
That's a great point, Jen, in this respect that you use the word the dump truck. And I use this in not only with our students here in teaching the Bible kinds of courses, but also using our Africa training partnership. One of the favorite concepts of our pastors in Africa is the idea of the information dump truck. And so they do the beep, 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 then we dump a bunch of content on them. And we do that in face-to-face classes as well. So we have to be cognizant of that kind of information dump, not only in face-to-face kinds of settings, but certainly online. It becomes even more overwhelming. So it's a principle to keep in mind, whether we're in face-to-face, hybrid, or online learning systems.
And just going back and remembering that while we may feel very secure and very knowledgeable about the content we're putting out to them, they don't. And so while we think, hey, this is easy, this isn't going to take them very long, because it wouldn't take me very long. But I've been doing this, this is my specialty, so to speak. So remembering that what we're putting out to them has to be put in the perspective of a brand new learner, not our own understanding of how to attack that content. I think sometimes we forget that it's not as easy for our learners as it is for us because we are so comfortable in what we teach and what we know.
Isn't that the curse of information? They talk about that when you know a bunch of stuff, like I recently was watching some YouTube videos on photography stuff, and trying to, get how to do this setting or whatever. And the guy's like, well, of course, everyone knows that the f-stop, blah, blah, blah. And then he just kind of moves on. Like, that's why I'm watching your video. I'm trying to figure this out, but he knows it and his buddies know it and everyone he works with knows it. So you should know it too. So yeah, getting back into that mindset of where they are, that's tricky. Yeah.
And that's the distance learning. When we're face to face, we see it on their faces and we sense the energy in the room. And when we're doing it online, we have to just be super cognizant of that because we won't have those nonverbals to guide us when we've hit the overload on them. So.
Yeah.
I think a guiding principle when you talk about engagement is going back to our learning theory. You boil down that priority of what do you want students to do? And Jen mentioned busy work and the dump truck. We always talk in our education classes. I say, remember a class when you were in high school when you thought the teacher gave you a lot of busy work. How excited were you about that? And we make our future teachers think in those lines of, remember when you're a student, don't do that to your own students. And so when you think about what you want your students to do, it has to be real, it has to be relevant, and it has to be meaningful, and they have to be doing something. Learning requires action. And so back to where Sam started, less is more. If I can have fewer quality engaging activities, students are going to get more about that. If you think of yourself as a learner, and Jen, you're in classes right now, it's that same concept. I can do these few things really well, and I'm going to demonstrate my learning. But those, even at the grad level, those classes that you're in, that you're getting nickel and dimed, and you're doing a bunch of stuff, by the end of it, you're like, I don't care. I'm jumping through hoops. I'm just trying to check something off the list, and I'm not engaging. And so I think that helps us think about what we want our students to do. If we can keep in mind, it needs to be real, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be quality.
Yeah.
Ken, I'd like to pick up on what David said.
Yeah, cool.
With the relevancy, because I think the bridge is starting with something that the students can build on, something that they already know, a skill they already can do, and then building the bridge from there to something that they value and they recognize is important for their lives or for our world today. I think that's where the relevancy comes in.
Yeah. And do they have to understand the relevance right away? I'm thinking like Karate Kid, right? Where he's wax on, wax off, and he's doing something and he's perfecting it, but he doesn't know how it all fits together. Do we do things? I mean, is that going to be part of our teaching where there are certain things that some basics that they have to understand, but they're not really going to get it until we've connected a few more dots?
I love that analogy. And I see Jen smiling and nodding her head, because we do that in our education classes all the time. She used the term a couple sessions ago of scaffolding, and we kind of defined how you build in supports to do something, and then maybe you switch gears and it's a different unit or a different topic, and you build in some supports and you slowly take it away. And the best feeling in the world as a teacher is when you get to the end of the semester, right, and the student goes, oh, yeah. I see how it all fits together, or I can do this. And back what we were doing in September when you taught us this one little thing, and now I see why it's relevant. And it's that aha moment where it all comes together. And isn't that what teaching's all about? So I think that analogy is right on target.
Yeah.
And I do think it's okay to sometimes build the connections for them. We want to give them a big picture. This is where we're headed. Our outcome is this at the end of the term. And as we build those little skills that we know how they're all going to fit together, it's okay to say, hey, when we did this, this is how it connects to this. We can't always expect them to do all of that. And if we can build some of those connections for them, they begin to stay engaged and go, oh, okay, I really am making progress towards this outcome we've laid out. So I think sometimes we feel like we can't tell them where they're headed, or we can't show them the obvious, because it's, again, obvious to us, not to them. We already know how it's all going to fit together. So being really explicit in our connections and making sure they know we know the journey we're on, we know the path we're taking, really gives confidence in the hard pieces of content that they begin to work through.
Yeah. Brene Brown in one of her books talks about where she went to Pixar studios, and they were talking about when they make movies, and they're brilliant at telling stories. And they're saying the hardest part of doing a movie for Pixar is that middle part. There's like scene 2, I think, or the second act or whatever, because it's actually the longest and it's necessary for the narrative to move forward. But it's easy to get bogged down, easy to lose sight of where you're going. And they say they spend like 90% of the time just that middle part, trying to figure out how to do that. And that's kind of what we have to do too, is kind of keep that story going. So we'll kind of just